No matter how big of a Street Fighter fan you are, it's extremely easy to play your favorite game in the series. Head to either Fightcade or Steam, click a few buttons, and you're ready to start throwing out fireballs. Simple. Well, I know you like a good mystery, dear viewer, so we're going to be exploring a Street Fighter title that has become lost to time. One that has been impossible to play for eons, even if you know exactly where to look, and believe me, I've done a lot of looking. First released in 2008, Street Fighter Online Mouse Generation was a PC free-to-play game that made exclusive use of the mouse. Yep, it didn't utilize the keyboard or even any controllers, just the mouse. This is already intriguing enough, but you can only imagine how dumbfounded I was when I saw that former President Barack Obama was playable. No, this isn't a bit, I haven't made this photo in Photoshop. A lost media Street Fighter game with playable Obama sounds too stupid to be true, so I had to investigate and try to get to the bottom of the madness. Our goal is to uncover the history behind Street Fighter Online, figure out how it played, and see if it left any sort of impact or legacy behind. Since I can't actually play the game for myself, I can't provide my objective opinion regarding game feel, so I'll be taking a more investigative, subjective approach to this journey. Buckle up and make sure to grab your favorite pointing device as we attempt to crack the enigma that is Street Fighter Online. Keeping with series tradition, Street Fighter Online was developed in the glorious land of Nippon, but unlike the mainline entries, development was mostly outsourced. It's true that Capcom was involved with the project's creation, but a bulk of it was handled by Diletto. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and guess that, like me, you've never heard of the studio before, and after researching their operations, I think I know why. If you try and Google Diletto, you're presented with photos of a man who has definitely seen better days, but if you add Capcom to the search, the answers we're looking for become clear. Sort of, at least. If you try to find exactly what Diletto does, there's a bunch of conflicting information from secondary sources that can easily get you lost in a rabbit hole, but there's one outlet that I found that I believe to be the most reputable. I stumbled across the corporate information section of Capcom's website, and if we scroll to the October 2006 section, we find our first official mention of Diletto. It's explained here that Diletto was the result of Capcom and Dwango, a Japanese telecommunications company, with its intention being to manage a portal website, but I was unable to discover what exactly this portal would lead to. Capcom's 2009 annual report document verifies this claim, with page 56 stating that Capcom owned a majority of Diletto, implying that Dwango was playing second fiddle with its partial ownership. So, with Capcom taking the reins of a new studio, they decided to put Diletto to the test and commission development of a brand new browser game. Here's where we run into a few roadblocks though, as some of the more specific questions I thought of didn't have verifiable answers online, so I've had to make some educated guesses going forward. The reasons behind why this game had to be part of the Street Fighter IP are unknown, but I assume it was because the series was making its grand return with Street Fighter 4, so this would have been a prime opportunity to capitalize on that game's hype. From looking at the Street Fighter Online footage, I wouldn't blame you if you thought that the character models kind of resembled action figures, but that's actually entirely intentional. I'll cover the gameplay implications of this later on, but what's currently important is that Diletto partnered with Kyoto, a figurine manufacturing company, to base the game's art style off their real-world figurines. I've never seen one in person, but apparently they're very flexible and high quality. I stumbled across a now-deleted Kotaku article that confirms this collaboration to be the case, although it still doesn't explain why it happened. I have no clue why Diletto decided to center their game's visuals around real-world figures, and because of how obscure Street Fighter Online is, there are no reputable outlets explaining how this came to be, which is, you know, the whole point of what I'm trying to uncover. Moving on, you may have noticed that many of the characters on screen are completely unknown, with there being a somewhat odd reason for this. Despite the game's name flat out saying Street Fighter, many of its characters come from other franchises, making it more of a crossover title. Batsu and Akira from Capcom's rival schools make appearances, which makes sense considering Capcom also made that game, but they only represent the tip of the iceberg. 5 of the game's characters come from Chinese wuxia novels written by the late author Louis Cha. Going under the pseudonym of Jin Yong, Cha is reported to have written 15 novels in his lifetime, and he was apparently quite revered in China's world of literature. He's a fascinating and often controversial figure, and I killed some time the other day going through his Wikipedia page, but that brings me to one burning question. How the hell did his characters appear in Street Fighter Online? In fact, how did characters from all over the anime and real world show up too? Believe me, I searched high and low for an official reason given as to how all of this came about, especially when it came to Obama, but I just couldn't find anything solid. My theory is that interviews surrounding Street Fighter Online are both extremely hard to find and conducted entirely in Japanese, meaning it's borderline impossible for me to unearth them. Because Diletto was collaborating with Kyoto, Louis Cha, and the studios behind various anime franchises, I assume they had seemingly infinite connections within the entertainment industry, and seemingly infinite amounts of money to throw at anyone they thought would fit the project. Hell, they even collaborated with Bandai to incorporate gacha elements as part of the game's economy, so I think profit would have been Deletto's motivating force above all else. At this point, I've seen so many wild things that I'm surprised I haven't been forced into a mental asylum, but what's really driving me crazy is the lack of concrete answers. This whole game seems like a massive shitpost, and I partially believe it's just a wide-scale collective delusion, which is what makes the dry spell of information so hard to bear. I tried finding interviews, developer retrospectives, player feedback, etc., and came up empty every time, although I did find a somewhat weird press conference. I have no idea what's going on here, but it seems that a Chun-Li cosplayer and a bikini lady were hired to promote the game. Sure, why not? You do you, Japan. The Street Fighter fandom website confirms that Revoltech, another figurine manufacturing company, lent their proprietary engine to Deletto for use in the game, but there's no source that confirms this to be the case. Also, I don't know why a company outside of the video game and animation worlds would have their own engine, but what I can confirm is that they made a bunch of figures to promote the game. They actually look pretty cool, and even some of the wuxia characters are here too. Okay, now that we know Deletto's backstory and some of the game's background information, let's explore Street Fighter Online's gameplay and character roster to figure out how it all worked. As we don't have direct access to Street Fighter Online, I've had to infer how the game functions from watching low-quality archival footage and by browsing the move list on the Street Fighter Wiki webpage, so forgive me if I miss something. As mentioned before, you only use the mouse to do battle, so it's the furthest thing from Street Fighter's regular 6-button control scheme. Moving the mouse left and right controls movement, with left click being punch and right click being kick. The middle mouse button was used for supers, and it seems as though players had up to 5 bars of meter, much like Marvel vs. Capcom. Combo structure also resembles Marvel, as it seems that Street Fighter Online contains a Magic Series system where normals can be freely chained together to begin combos. In all the videos I watched during my research, I always saw an insane looking air combo following a super jump, confirming that aerial mobility and aggression played a large role in the title's moment-to-moment gameplay. But it's not all about leaping to the skies, as most of your time spent outside of combos will be on the ground. Movement here looks loose and slippery, as if you were sliding on ice or floating through the air. I don't think I've seen a character in the game with slow walk or dash speed, so the general battle system looks quite frantic and offense-focused, but that doesn't mean it's all one-sided. Defensive techniques like air teching shows up here too, as well as bursts and air dashes. These especially look nuts, as Chun-Li is about to break the space-time continuum with her speed. Also, there seems to be a mechanic where you can absorb enemy attacks to build meter. It looks a lot like Street Fighter 6's parry system, but you still take damage when activating it. Alpha counters also join the party, with the retaliating fighter flashing red in the process. I'm not sure if Deletto's staff were playing Guilty Gear non-stop during development, but it's fascinating to see mechanics like these in a Street Fighter game. You can even burst out of supers, which is nuts, and I'm glad that the developers included strong defensive options. Now that I think about it, Street Fighter Online's battle mechanics are quite dense, as there are a multitude of both offensive and defensive ways for players to interact with one another, and I'm honestly quite impressed that a browser game is this detailed. All of this is controlled with the mouse, and with there only being 3 buttons and so many ways to move the thing, I wonder how consistent it all was to control. To make things crazier, according to the move lists I found online, every single special move can be performed in the air, as well as most supers. All of this confirms, at least in my mind, that Street Fighter Online was more of an anime fighter than you would initially think, which is an interesting direction to go in. The anime fighter subgenre is known for its complexity, so including its mechanics into a free-to-play title designed for casual players is certainly unique. Speaking of casuals, the game's roster contains all sorts of weird inclusions, with fellow Japanese series Cyborg 009, Detroit Metal City, and Space Sheriff Gavan having playable fighters here as well. I'm not super into anime, so that's probably why I haven't heard of these series before, but I can imagine that their representation must have puzzled their fanbases, hopefully in a good way. Every fighter also contains vastly different move lists, with Akira, for example, having a whole series of wreckers. Compare that to Detroit Metal City's Krauser, and yeah, I'll stick with this guy for his ease of use. Going back to Akira, I'd like to highlight this line right here. If this is true, then certain attacks were locked behind specific paid cosmetic items, which is pretty shady. This phenomenon also applies to the other fighters, so I hope you're ready to hit the gacha casino. This ties into what I said before about the action figure gameplay implications, and if you were wondering why some characters look like randomly generated Saints Row protagonists, there's a good reason. Street Fighter Online contains extensive character customization, with players being encouraged to purchase digital items that could be equipped onto their fighters. I think this was somewhat meant to replicate the experience of customizing real-world action figures, but let's be honest, it was most likely done for monetary reasons. This old video I found gives us a glimpse as to what the pre-battle menu looked like, with a full rotation of your fighter's model being on display, although extra footage from the aforementioned press conference lets us witness another pre-battle menu. I'm unsure if this is from a different build of the game or if it's just another menu entirely, but it seems as though this is where you would challenge other players. I also don't know how this is the case, but it seems that Zangief has a multi-hitting DP, so I assume you can alter your fighter's move list before battle. Looking at it holistically, I believe Deletto wanted players to have their own unique fighters with slight differences from one another. This video indicates that a stat system was also part of the game, with the red and blue Japanese characters translating to attack and defense respectively. I tried to translate the final character into English, but no website I used was able to do this, so if you know what this means, please leave a comment. All of these systems are certainly ambitious, but I can't help but wonder if there was a specific combination of items that would make you overwhelmingly powerful. If this was the case, there would also need to be a strong anti-cheat system, or else it would turn into Tekken Revolution, but I'm going off topic. Street Fighter Online's gameplay is surprisingly detailed, very much so, but I assume that not many people were happy with the roster. Classic fighters like Ryu, Chun-Li, and Guile were doing battle with who? What? And the iconic huh? And I don't believe that the carryover between Street Fighter, old school anime, and Chinese wuxia novel fans would have been very high. Before we move on, I would also like to circle back to Obama for a moment. Despite being one of the most popular figures on the planet, I found no surviving gameplay footage of his inclusion. The only evidence that actually proves he was in the game were these two screenshots. I also have no idea how he even made it into the game at all in the first place. Perhaps someone on the Japanese dev team who was really into American politics lobbied for his inclusion? I'm really not sure, but hey, it goes to show that reality is often stranger than fiction. Anyway, the gameplay looks absolutely cracked, and I can only dream of what players would find if the public had access to its mechanics nowadays. I guarantee you that someone with an anime profile picture would find an unburstable touch of death in the first week alone. Normally, here's where I would discuss reviews and the long-lasting impact of a certain title, but none of this can be said for Street Fighter Online. As the game was only accessible for a few years in a country smaller than Texas, I'm not shocked to find that press coverage was minimal. Plus, online content creation and video game streaming in 2008 was significantly smaller than it is today, making it nigh impossible to decipher how the Street Fighter fanbase judged the game. The only resource I was able to find was a lengthy Resetera thread, but this doesn't contain anything that we don't already know. Reception to the title couldn't have been too positive, however, as on June 1st, 2009, Kotaku reported that Street Fighter Online was shutting down for good later that August. Deletto's official statement merely mentioned that quote-unquote various reasons led to the game's downfall, but this is obviously very vague on purpose. For an online game to shut down this quickly, it must have had extremely poor player retention rates and profited far below its budget. Live service games are really expensive after all, so if not many people are playing, you might as well pull the plug and move on to the next thing. On the bright side, I guess this game was alive longer than Concord? I think I have to give it that. It was at this point that I searched for information regarding Deletto's next project, but much to my surprise, there was none. Yeah, Capcom never commissioned Deletto to develop another video game. Not even a small-scale mobile title came out of the studio, so I assume they worked quietly in the background on non-game related endeavors, things like maintaining websites and whatnot. Later, in February 2011, Capcom astonished everyone by unveiling a press release explaining that they had decided to merge with Deletto. They explained that Deletto is engaged primarily in the operation of internet portal sites. In recent years, rapid growth in the popularity of social games has brought about a major shift in the operating environment. Capcom has decided to merge with Deletto for the purpose of overcoming the challenges posed by the new market conditions. Okay, in non-PR speak, that pretty much means that Capcom saw Deletto as a valuable asset, one that could assist with the managing of their push for social games. I don't know if you remember, but Capcom was shooting mobile games out of all of the holes in the early 2010s, and as Deletto was rendered defunct by the merger, it makes sense why they would no longer be credited on any projects. It's because they didn't exist anymore. Remember how Blue Castle Games were bought out by Capcom and had their name changed to Capcom Vancouver following the release of Dead Rising 2? Well, the situation with Deletto was more or less identical, but instead of developing kick-ass zombie games that led to their slow and painful death, they would stay in their lane of support work. Following the merger, there were no public mentions of what Deletto became. I assume they're currently a skeleton crew within Capcom who aren't working on anything major, but there's also no evidence to prove that this is the case, so it's just my speculation. It's almost as if their output completely vanished once the Capcom acquisition had finalized, and I wonder what they've worked on since. Traveling forward into the present day reveals that Capcom has surprisingly made a few efforts to keep the game's memory alive. It's nothing too crazy, mind you, but the game's original protagonist, Shin, received brand new artwork on the Street Fighter V website. Shin also makes an appearance in Udon's Street Fighter Masters Game Gal's comic book, although it's reported that he loses to Juri in a fight. Now that I mentioned Juri, she was somewhat of a trailblazer for being Street Fighter's first Korean character, but really that title should belong to Shin. He was doing Taekwondo and representing South Korea years before Juri hit the scene, but as our favorite lovable psychopath appeared in the mainline entries, it's a no-brainer as to why she's enormously more popular. Aside from that, Street Fighter Online doesn't have much in the way of an observable legacy. Capcom never attempted to release a browser-based Street Fighter title again, with their online effort shifting towards the growing mobile game space. Live service Street Fighter games do exist on smartphones, but they have next to nothing in common with Street Fighter Online, which is no surprise. It sucks to say, but this game just kind of came and went, and there aren't many people who know about it or have even played it. I wish I was one of them, but the game's termination has made this nothing but a fleeting desire. Unless someone can find a copy of Street Fighter Online, get it to run on modern operating systems, and maintain fan servers with playable netcode, I can't see anyone ever getting to experience the game again. Despite spending the past few days tearing my hair out doing research, I've somewhat developed an affection for Street Fighter Online. I've always been a big fan of Japanese exclusive works, so my nerd brain wishes it could throw out a Hadouken using the mouse. I feel that a deadly concoction consisting of always online gameplay, a character roster made up mostly of unknowns, and a puzzling art style is what killed the game's chances of being a success. When looking at the current gaming landscape, I also can't envision a positive reception. Mobile fighting games with touchscreen controls had their heyday around 13 years ago, so it couldn't do well in that form, and a browser-exclusive game also doesn't make much sense nowadays either. I don't ever see a way for a title like this to not crash and burn, and since it didn't do too well when it was fresh and exciting and brand new, I think the concept itself, just on a base core level, just wasn't cut out to be developed into a full game. With that being said, I still love it though, and if you want to play something that looks kind of similar, I would actually recommend Tatsunoko vs Capcom. This game has a universal air dash, a burst, and some truly crazy combos, so you should check it out, it's pretty fun. Yes, I know I'm grasping at straws here, but just let me cope. Okay, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you and your time, and I hope you had fun. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.